So welcome to
Hello.
Conversations with our Editor, a webinar for all IADR members who review for our journals, for anyone new to the peer review process, or any researchers who are thinking about contributing to this very important research contribution. And what I think is a really important skill to learn as an author. So in this webinar, we will be specifically answering the questions that were sent in by our editorial and scientific advisory board members. So thank you so much to all our members for your fantastic questions. In this first webinar, we'll be looking at some of the most common questions that were set that are of interest to peer reviewers. This includes, how do we select reviewers? Um, how do editors make decisions? And what makes a good reviewer? In our second webinar, we were going to be looking at the hot topic of generative AI. It is my pleasure to introduce our editors, a fantastic experience as part of this webinar. So let's start with Nick. Nick, would you like to introduce yourselves to our audience?
Sure. Well, thanks very much, Vanessa. So I'm Nick Jakubovics. I'm based at Newcastle University in the UK, and I'm editor-in-chief of the Journal of Dental Research.
And Jocelyne?
Yes, hi, I'm Jocelyne Feine, and I'm the editor-in-chief of the JDR CTR. I'm Professor Emerita from McGill University, and happily ensconced right now in Florida, where the weather is warm.
I'm across the Atlantic. My name is Vanessa Muirhead. I'm so glad to be the moderator for this webinar. I'm based at Queen Mary University of London. I'm a public health dentist and a mixed method researcher, and I'm the associate editor of JDR CTR. So let's start with our fantastic questions. One of the really important questions, some of the questions that are related to the scope of our journal. So great question, really highly experienced editors. Let's start with Nick. What distinguishes the JDR as a journal in terms of the scope?
Okay, well, thanks very much, Vanessa. So I think it's important as a reviewer to have some familiarity with the journal that you're reviewing for, because each different journal does look for different things. The scope of the Journal of Dental Research is actually very broad. We cover anything in the field of dental, oral, and craniofacial research. We do look for studies that have high levels of novelty. We see ourselves as a leading journal within the field, and therefore we're looking for studies that really bring something new. And we're thinking about things that are more of a step change, for example, than for, say, an incremental advance. And we also think carefully about impact. So we're looking for papers that have potential impact. And impact can be interpreted in different ways. It could be something that makes a direct change to clinical practice. It could be something that builds the science, so has scientific impact, or it could be, for example, something that potentially could lead to change in policy. So there are different ways of looking at impact, but we do look for something that's going to make a difference. We're an international journal, so we're always conscious that our readers come from all over the world, and as a result, papers need to have that broad reach. So the editors do a level of screening before they pass papers to peer reviewers, but we do expect peer reviewers, if they feel that papers are not quite up to the level of the journal, and the peer reviewers are the ones with the real expertise on the subject, then please let us know your thoughts, and there are areas on the form to state that.
That's really great in terms of JDR and cutting edge research and novelty is what you're looking for. What about the JDR CTR, Jocelyne? What papers do you publish in the JDR CTR?
Yeah, so like the JDR, we're also looking for novelty and impact and report, particularly those that can have an impact on the health of the population. but we start out at a level of phase 3 clinical trials and forward along the translational spectrum. So we publish any studies that involve individuals, humans, and populations, including epidemiologic and health services, implementation science, economic assessments, and using methodologies that involve quantitative, qualitative, mixed methods, and other methodologies. So we focus on the that part of the translational spectrum that moves into human subject and beyond that type of research.
Okay, so much more translational in the JDR covers. So a related question that someone's asked about cutting edge and interdisciplinary research, and they've really asked about, do you only publish novel research, or do you also accept confirmatory publications? Mick, what are your thoughts about that? Do you
Okay.
allow confirmatory publications, or is it only novel findings?
So we do look, as I mentioned, for studies that have high levels of novelty. That's really what we're looking at for. But of course, it's known nowadays in science that there is really a need to replicate research, and strong replication studies can be very valuable in themselves. And so there can be a case in some situations where we would consider strong replication studies that are in an area of high importance and that brings something extra to the domain. So that could be a strong validation of a very important topic. So there are cases where we might consider what you call confirmatory studies. The other thing to note is that we consider other article types. So we have review article types. Our critical reviews require an invite, but those ones also go out to peer review. So peer reviewers may be looking at those and looking at them in a slightly different light. And then I did want to mention one type of article that peer reviewers may not be that familiar with, which we call registered reports. And these are not replication studies. They're a totally different approach. They're clinical studies generally. And what they do, we have a mechanism whereby people can basically submit their article, their report at the point where they're designing, for example, a clinical trial. And those reports can then be reviewed at the point of trial design. And potentially, if they're accepted, then we agree that we will publish the results of the trial when they come out later down the road. So that's a slightly different design. Reviewers may not be that familiar with it, but other journals are bringing this out as a mechanism. And what it's intended to do is to guard against this publication bias where we only publish studies, clinical trials that show positive results. And what we're trying to do with registered reports is to ensure that we agree to publish regardless of whether results show positive or no benefit of the clinical intervention. And at the same time, the other advantage is that the peer reviewers can actually give tips and ideas and critical analysis that can feed in at the study design stage when it's not too late to change. So there are advantages of these registered reports, and I just wanted to flag that's also an option to study.
Okay, oh, that's really, really helpful, Nick, because I don't think many reviewers or authors would know of that. And that's really, really helpful. That's one of the questions that we had about later on about publishing negative findings. What about JDR CTR, Jocelyne? Do you publish confirmatory publications?
Yes, in fact, the type of research that we predominantly publish really requires more than one publication. We need a body of evidence. And so as long as the expert reviewers indicate to us that this is an important addition to the literature, where it adds more in terms of information or confirms the information that we have and we don't yet rely on it, or comes up with a new angle on looking at this particular topic, then those are the types of things that we would consider strongly. Nick brought up the negative results issue, and we really believe that if the study's well done and adequately powered, negative results can be extremely important. So don't hesitate if you do have a strong paper, even if your findings are negative, please consider submitting it, because this is very important for other researchers to know.
Yeah.
So yes, and then we're not doing the registered reports yet that Nick mentioned, but we would certainly consider something like that if someone were to contact us about it.
That's really helpful. So if we were publishing in a different clinical population and we showed novelty and we showed some new insights, that would be really, really important. We've had a few questions, Nick. We're going to come to you about reviewer selection. How does the JDR select reviewers, and what qualifies, and what are the qualities we're looking for in our reviewers?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So we at the JDR, we are looking for reviewers that have strong expertise in the field. So one way that we'd look for that is whether people have a record of publication in journals of equivalent standing to the JDR. So not necessarily everyone's published papers in the JDR previously, but they're publishing in strong journals. Um, we, however, people do need to get in at some point, and so it is important that you try and promote yourself if you want to become a reviewer. And one of the things you can do is create a profile on something like ORCID. There are various systems, and ORCID is probably the best known of them. So this is a researcher identification profile, and that can really help us find you. And we have a register of reviewers. We keep a database, and if you sign up on Scholar One, that's a platform that we currently use for reviewing. You can create an account at the journal. You can create one at either JDR or JDR CTR. Add your name as a reviewer, and if you add keywords, then we can potentially find you as we're searching for reviewers. So those are the kinds of things that we look for in terms of qualifying as a reviewer. And selecting a reviewer for a specific paper, we then will search for someone with the right expertise.
Yeah. So yeah, you've just highlighted the keywords aspect and how important it is to ensure that you have keywords that are relevant. Which brings us to the other question about what makes a good reviewer. We all love good reviewers. So, what makes a good reviewer? What stands out, and what distinguishes a good reviewer?
I just want to add to Nick's response to the last question, and that's that the JDR CTR does use the same criteria as the JDR. And what's really important is if you have a very common name, particularly a common last name, when we go to look for other reports that you may have published to see what you've done to determine whether you'd be a good reviewer for a particular paper, if you have a listing in ORCID, it's much easier for us to find you than to put your name in, say, PubMed or one of the search engines. So in fact, for some people, it's virtually impossible for us to find out what you've done if you have a very common last name. So please consider getting onto ORCID. So I just want to emphasize that.
That's really good tip. That's really, really helpful, Jocelyne. So just going back, Nick, to what makes a good reviewer. What are we looking for in a good reviewer?
Okay, so I think this really gets to the heart of this conversation we're having today, and it is a real skill to learn to be a good reviewer, and I think it's a really important skill in a scientific career, because if you're good at reviewing, then you're good at critically analyzing things, and you're also good at framing your responses. And so these are all the kinds of skills that you need in science as a whole. So what we look for are reviewers who are conscientious, who are going to read the paper thoroughly. It does take time, we acknowledge that, but if you're going to do a good review, you do need to to put the time in, read the paper thoroughly, look at it from a standpoint of looking at the overview. Do the results make sense? Do the interpretations follow from the results? So please point out the sort of key overarching things in the paper. And the other thing we're looking for are reviewers to give us a timely review. So the whole review process does need to be timely because otherwise papers can drag on for months on end sometimes. And it's very discouraging for authors when they've put in a lot of work to wait around and potentially see other papers overtaking the science. So it's very important to be both timely and conscientious in your reviews.
Yeah, I think those are really important. I would just add, as an associate editor, I think another really important component of being a reviewer is to be committed to the whole review process. So if the paper comes back and you're asked to do a second or third review, it's really important that you do commit to that, because it's really frustrating, and it's really frustrating for authors, but always frustrating for us to trying to find another reviewer. So I think it's really important that you commit to the whole cycle, the whole process from start to finish. I don't know if you would agree, Nick or Jocelyn, in terms of that.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree, because a lot of the time the editors don't have the skills or the background to be able to assess the responses that the authors made to the reviewer. So as a reviewer, you can't assume that we're going to be able to vet the response from the author for you. We really do need your second and third comments if necessary, to find out if the author has truly responded to the concerns that you've had.
Yeah. Nick,
Yeah,
you,
I think that's particularly important if you've given a detailed review, because then you really need to be able to assess the response. And I think sometimes people give a detailed review, they don't feel the paper's quite up to the standard, and so they recommend reject. And having made that recommendation, they feel that they don't need to look at another version of it. But actually, sometimes the other reviewers feel a bit more positive about the paper, and the editor overall decides that it is worth pursuing. And then actually, it's really important that we're able to get your input onto another version. So even if you're recommending reject, it's very helpful if you tick the box saying that you're happy to review another version of it.
yeah. Yeah, I think that's really important. You raised the issue about, when you've got rejection and someone else and recommends that there's a potential for it to be modified. That yeah, the reviewers are peers. Peer reviews are not necessarily expert, and so it's really important. That's why we have more than one reviewer. So yeah, that commitment to re-reviewing the paper is very important. So we supervise PhD students, and we really recognize the importance of learning. You mentioned peer reviewing being a really important learning opportunity. And so someone has asked about how do you involve or nominate early career researchers to gain that experience, because it really is experiential. So, how do you do that as a reviewer? How can you invite early career researchers or PhD students or MSc students?
So shall I just explain the mechanism we've got at the JDR
Yeah.
first? And then sorry to cut you off, Jocelyne, but I just wanted to explain the mechanism that we've got, and I'm not sure if it applies to both journals, but we now have a mechanism whereby if we invite a review from somebody, if you feel that you're able to mentor an early career researcher while you're doing the review, then we actually allow this process, and all we ask is that firstly you do it as a mentoring exercise, and you share the manuscript only with that person. It mustn't go to anyone else because of confidentiality, but we do allow you to share it with the nominated person. They can then feed into the review, but we ask you, as the person we've invited, to have oversight of the process and to submit the final review. And then we just ask you to name the early career researcher when you've put in your review so that they can also get credit for doing it. Just be aware that we have given now in our invite letters, we give permission for you to share the confidential review with an early career researcher. If journals don't give that permission, then please do not share confidential reports unless you have permission from the editor
Yeah.
to do so, because
Yeah.
manuscripts are confidential and should not be shared. But we now allow that.
Yeah. Yeah, I
Sorry.
think that's really important, the confidentiality aspect. Jocelyne, I think it's the same for JDR CTR. Do you want to?
Yeah, that was basically what I wanted to cover, and I'm glad you did a thorough job on that, Nick.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that we do the same thing with
Yeah.
JDR CTR.
Yeah.
They have the same invitation letter, and we would encourage reviewers, if you're working closely with your graduate students, to work with them on this because this is great training for them as
Yeah.
well.
Yeah. Now we're moving to a related area, thinking about the expectations. And some people have actually spoken to me, and I think this is a really interesting question posed by one of the members, is that it can be quite overwhelming when you're doing your first review. And this idea that you have to be an expert. So the questions are, are we expecting reviewers to be experts? Especially, for instance, if a paper's on learning on language LLMs, are we expecting them to be familiar and expert in AI or special technique? Jocelyne, so what's your answer to that? Are we expecting reviewers to be experts?
Yeah, well, experts with their keywords. So basically, if we get a paper, say if I get a paper that involves AI and it's in a particular discipline, say it's in childhood caries, then we may invite an expert in childhood caries and an expert in AI. If there's complex statistical analyses in another paper, we may ask a biostatistician. We expect the reviewers to have at least the basic understandings of the most classic biostatistical techniques.
Okay.
And so if there's basic biostatistics, we generally don't invite a biostatistical expert. But if something is more complex, then it's likely that we do that. But still, when you're a reviewer, if you feel as though there is some aspect of the paper that you don't feel comfortable reviewing, we want you to let us know. We want you in the comments to the editor, or even in your review, you can say, I'm not an expert in this aspect, but I can comment on that aspect. And so let us know what you can do. And this is another reason why it's so important to do timely reviews, because if we need, then once we hear from you that we need to have an expert reviewer come in, then if it's a late review, then the author has to wait even longer for us to get an expert reviewer to agree to review the paper. So the sooner you can do your review, and do let us know if you feel as though you cannot adequately assess some aspect of the paper, then we will know very quickly and we can get in another reviewer. So we do try, though, to bring in as many reviewers as we can to cover all the aspects of every paper.
Okay, so you're saying that you don't necessarily have to be an expert in all areas of the paper, but you just need to be able to be very clear about where your expertise lies. For instance, if you're in health economics, you can comment on that. And I don't think people use that comments to the editor section enough, really. I think that's a really good a bit of advice. So you've sort of answered some of the questions. The next question is about statistical techniques, and some suggested having a checklist for statistical analysis. What are your views about this? Do you need to be an expert in statistics? Should we use checklists? I'll come on to Nick in a second. What are your views about this, Jocelyne?
Oh, okay. Well, so basically what I have already said.
Yeah.
is if it looks complex, and we recognize that because we can make that mistake, and we also need to make sure that your keywords are up to date,
Yeah.
so that you as we go through our careers, we often change um, uh, what we're looking at more closely, and so it needs periodically, our keywords do need to be updated. So we're going with the keywords that we have. So you may find that it doesn't exactly mesh with yours. So yeah, and in terms of biostatistics and checklists, I think we should turn that one over to Nick and
Yeah. Yeah, Nick,
about.
do you want to mention the OHStat checklist?
Yeah, certainly. So there was an exercise that was developed over a few years and then published relatively recently across a number of oral health journals, including JDR and JDR CTR, which put out a new checklist specific to oral health statistics called the OHStat checklist. So it's available. It's widely available either by searching the journals or looking on the Equator Network. And Equator is a central resource that stores lots of different checklists relevant to different study designs. But OHStat is just designed as a prompt to help reviewers, authors, and editors to look at the statistical parameters and just to get a bit of a feel for the statistics. So it can be helpful to have a prompt like this. We wouldn't say you need to necessarily, as a reviewer, go through every item on a long checklist. But it can be a useful framework if a paper is really centered on statistics, or if statistics are really key to understanding the paper, then it can be very useful. And alongside the checklist itself, there's an explanation and elaboration document which describes in a bit more detail some of the issues. So those sorts of things can be very helpful. There are a number of, as I say, Equator hosts a number of different checklists, and we do insist that people use them for certain study designs. And those checklists are there for a reason, again, not just for the authors, but they can also help reviewers identify different points. So things like consort for clinical trials, and arrive is an important one for
Yeah.
animal research
Yeah.
studies.
Yeah, I think, yeah, I agree. The Equator is a really fantastic resource, and I would just highlight the CoreX if you're doing qualitative studies. It's a really good checklist. Now we're going to come again to the expectations of reviewers. So we're all very busy academic life. We're giving up the time, and we know that reviewers give up their time, and we really appreciate it in terms of their busy schedules. So the question is about expectations and about things like copywriting and editing. Are we expecting reviewers to correct spelling, grammar, formatting issues? Um, is that
No, no, we don't look for reviewers to do that. Reviewers
yeah,
are not proofreaders. We if you notice something that's really important to the interpretation of the science, then it's helpful to point it out. But you don't need to look for very small sort of grammatical points and so on. We ask you to focus really on the science. That's what we're aiming for. There is one thing that I should mention with regard to sort of grammar and language. If you feel that a paper that has come, often we get papers from all over the world, and often they're not people who necessarily have English as their first language. So if you notice that a paper really looks like it would benefit from English language editing, then you can flag that to the editor. And there is a mechanism, our publisher Sage has just introduced a mechanism whereby they can provide English language editing services free of charge to authors at sort of later stages in the review process. So if reviewers identify that a paper would really benefit from that service, then please do raise that to the editor as soon as you notice, and then we can put that in place. But really don't worry too much about sort of minor grammatical issues.
I think lots of people will be very happy about that.
Yeah.
A related question is about the formatting. So if you notice in the paper there are some formatting issues, or in particular if the photographs or images are not of good quality, or there are consent issues, is that something that you can raise as a reviewer? So formatting issues, if the quality of the photos, images are not of good quality, is that your role as a reviewer?
I, I think in terms of figures, I think it is important that
Yeah.
we can understand the science from the figures. And sometimes we see figures that are really very small and basically the font is completely unreadable. And if you can't read it and interpret the figure, then you can't judge it. So you need to point that out in the peer review.
Yeah.
Obviously, there are technical issues sometimes with converting to PDFs, but if you can't read the figure, please flag it because we don't want that sitting on the system. Basic sort of formatting of papers and layout is not something to
Yeah.
worry about in detail
Yeah.
by any
Yeah.
means.
Yeah.
You mentioned consent issues, and we will be talking in more detail about ethics in the second webinar. But if you do have concerns about ethics, sometimes images, photos need to be appropriately anonymized, or if not, then they need specific ethical specific
Yeah.
consent, I should say, from the
Yeah.
subject. So if you have any concerns, please feel free to raise
Yeah.
them. And again,
Yeah.
the box of confidential comments to the editor
Yeah.
can be used to raise any of these
Yeah.
kind of issues.
Yeah, so that's really clear. Any formatting issues in typos, spellings, mistakes, that's not the role of the reviewer. But if there are things in terms of comprehension of images, because that's a really critical appraisal, that's understanding the fundamentals of the findings, you can highlight that as a reviewer. That's really helpful. Now, Justin, we're going to move on to the questions about how to review a paper, the nuts and bolts. So we've had some comments about questions and guidance and advice for reviewers about providing well-structured reviews. So yeah, question, Jocelyne, how should they be highlighting major and minor comments? And what are your recommendations about producing a well-structured, balanced review?
So I think first that you just kind of summarize what the paper shows, and then have a general straight statement about the strengths. And then you can get into the weaknesses. And usually we look for the major issues first, and then the minor issues. So if you just start out by just clarifying in just a couple sentences what the paper's about, and then the strengths, and then the weaknesses with major and minor. I think that's really a nice structure to follow, and it helps the author to know, first of all, you've picked up on the strengths of the paper and what it's all about, but then you're pointing out the weaknesses. And as we tell authors, this is a conversation that we are having, the editors and the reviewers are having with the authors. In order, the whole point is to improve the publication and to improve the report. So the comments we would expect should be respectful and clear and helpful, basically.
Yeah, I think that's really important, and going through the paper systematically in different sections as well. And I think also ensuring that the interpretation, the discussion really matches what the data is showing or what the study is showing. It's really important. I think, Nick, you've touched on some of this before in terms of checklists, in terms of guidance. Some board members have suggested using guidance such as Strobe, and you mentioned OHStats to focus on specific parts of the manuscript. What are your sort of thoughts about this?
Yeah, when I mention checklists, they can be very helpful. As I say, some of these checklists are quite detailed and quite long. And I think what we don't necessarily want to get into is feeling like the checklist is the only thing when you come to review the paper. I think it can be helpful they can be useful and pick up some important points if things are not adequately explained. The checklist sometimes gives you an idea. But really, we're looking for you to sort of read the paper and follow and think about whether or not a reader, someone who would be a standard readership for the journal, would be able to follow it. And are the, as Jocelyne says, are the conclusions, or one of you, sorry, said, are the conclusions actually really fitting with the results? Is the evidence strong enough to make the conclusions that are being made? And one example that we often see is people will make claims about causal effects in, for example, epidemiological studies, where it can be actually very difficult to prove cause. And in fact, the language should be more around association. So that's just one example of the kinds of issues that you might look for.
Yeah, yeah, and highlighting what they've put in the limitation section. I get another members has mentioned maybe providing like a list of common red flags to watch out for as peer reviewers. We've seen lots of red flags. Both of you have seen. And what do you think about this in terms of red flags? Would you suggest any red flags and to look out for as a peer reviewer?
Well, there are certainly things that we identify relatively regularly with studies, and we've talked about sort of overinterpretation of results. That's one, and one example where that can come about is if, for example, people don't have appropriate controls in order to have confidence in what the results mean. You have to have the right controls in order to have a strong interpretation. So thinking about, are the results solid? Are they well controlled? Are the multiple lines of evidence providing a strong evidence base that something is happening? We do, if you're aware of prior publications in the area, I mean, direct sort of plagiarism we have checks for, but we are not experts in the specific field. And if you know that the authors have published something very similar or that there's other similar research out there, that's very important to think about and look at. We are increasingly looking at AI and the misuse of AI, which we'll discuss more in the next webinar. So I won't go into too much detail, but there are some red flags in terms of wording and possibly things like hallucinated references. If you notice those sort of things, please mention it to the editor if you're suspicious about the use of AI. We want to see a strong rationale for studies. That's one of the things that we often think about. And I would note that the rationale that something has not been done is not a good rationale to do a study. Lots of things haven't been done doesn't mean they're all worth investigating. So I think it needs to have a strong rationale for the study, and that should be developed through the introduction. And then the presentation, the overall presentation, does it make sense? Could it be improved? And the literature, are the authors using the latest up-to-date literature in the field? Because if they're not, then there's a risk that they've missed some literature and some papers that are very relevant or have already covered aspects of their study, and they're not comparing the results properly with the right literature. So that's another thing to look for. So there are lots of different issues that we commonly find, but overall it's really reading it and seeing whether it sort of makes sense and critically thinking about, is the evidence properly supported.
I think that's really helpful. The two things that I really picked up in your response is the prior publication. I think as reviewers, that's something they are in a really, really strong position to be able to do in their field. And sometimes we don't always pick up on that because we're not experts. So I think that's a really important role for reviewers to play if you identified prior publication or similar publication. And then the other one was weak rationale for the study. I think I see that lots of times, and I see, this study has not been done in this population. And my question is, so what makes it different? Why is this relevant? So I think that's really, really important, those two really component parts about red flags.
Vanessa, you
Yes.
raised the question that I wanted to bring up.
Okay. Yeah.
So what question? So
Yeah.
what? So what if you did this? So what does it mean? And the JDR CTR has a small section where we ask the authors to write a brief statement on the knowledge translation factor. And the question is how will the results of your study contribute to the health of the population? And so that's the so what factor in these papers. So I just to tell
I
you
think, yeah. I think that's really good. And I think we should do another webinar on how to write a knowledge translation statement because it's really difficult because we're not really good at it as researchers. And I think that's a really important skill. So yeah. Now we're going to move on to the decisions and the role of the editor because I think that is a bit of an elusive. Everyone seems to think, how do we make the decisions? And one member has sort of asked a question about the decision-making process and about what happens when we've got a manuscript that's gone through many rounds. But the authors haven't corrected and new issues emerge. How do you deal with that? So yeah, that's the first question to you, Jocelyne.
So
About how to make decisions and what do we do if there's many rounds. Then yeah.
It's a big question, Vanessa, and it's an important question. So the way that editors, or the way that I look at this, is that if the problem is something that can be corrected, in other words, if the paper's important enough, it's in an important field, and if the protocol is proper and it looks as though the issues are more in terms of the way that the individual has written, or that they may have drawn conclusions that are not really valid, but the work itself is good and could be publishable, then that may be more of a major revision as opposed to a rejection. Rejection would be, this has been done before, and this is a replication study, but it doesn't offer anything that really supports what's been done or new. Or if it's a study and if it's a study that is a good example of replication, for example, and yet it hasn't been done properly and it cannot be corrected, then that can be a rejection. But just so that you understand that your decision, the decision we ask you to make, is not necessarily the decision that the other reviewers may have come to. And so then it's up to the editor, the associate editor, to read these reviews and to understand, really, is this a problem that cannot be corrected? Is the paper important enough that we would want the authors to basically rewrite sections or maybe redo an analysis where things can be corrected? Then if everyone agrees that it's an important paper, then yes, then we will put it through for more reviews. But if there are problems in data collection, in the protocol itself, Nick mentioned this before, if there's no control group, and a control group is needed, if there's no report on sample size calculation, and I mean, these are things that are very, very difficult to come back to and make changes. So these are things that may require a rejection. So the editors will take all the comments from all the reviewers and then come to a decision in terms of whether it's a major revision or whether it's going to be a reject.
And so that makes it really clear that what you're saying, and I think what you're both saying, is that if the paper is methodologically flawed in some way, if the results are incorrect, then that would be the reason for a rejection. But if the paper is somehow modifiable with revision or writing or reanalysis, then that's something that you may recommend a major or minor. And I think the other aspect I think you really made clear was that as a reviewer, you don't make the ultimate decision, you make a recommendation, and it's the editor that makes the decision.
Yes.
So I think that was a bit of the confusion. I think that takes the pressure off a reviewer really, because ultimately it's your job, Nick and Jocelyne, to make those decisions. And reviewers are just making a recommendation, and we use many recommendations to make the final decision.
Yes,
Is that right?
the most important thing really is for the reviewer to let us know whether this is something that can be
Yeah,
corrected or not. And
yeah,
that's very helpful to us.
yeah. Which brings in me, Nick, to the issues of not sure if many people know or many reviewers are aware of this issue of the desk rejection, when the editor decides to reject the paper without sending it for review. So some people have suggested that we should make that clear, and maybe give some reasons about why manuscripts are rejected at that level. Maybe you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so we get very high volumes of submissions, and we literally cannot send them all out to peer review because it would be overburdening our pool of conscientious and dedicated reviewers. And some or many papers we can recognize at the editorial analysis stage, the first stage, that they're not suited to the journal for some reason. They're not the right fit. Typically, it's because they don't have the high level of novelty or the potential for impact that we're really looking for. And the editors can make that decision. And so we will reject quite a large proportion of the papers we receive. And it's not uncommon to get a fairly quick decision from the editors that the paper is not suitable. And by making a quick decision, we ensure that you can then go and find a more appropriate venue for your manuscript. So it may seem hard when you don't get any peer review comments at all, but it actually does mean that you can then go and find a better outlet. We can't, unfortunately, give very detailed comments on those papers that what we call desk reject, because we're not conducting a full peer review. We're just recognizing that it doesn't quite fit the journal for some reason. And so we tend to just give a relatively short explanation, but we do try to give some kind of explanation for why we're rejecting things. But please be aware that if you do get a rejection, whether it's a desk rejection or whether it's been through peer review, unfortunately those decisions really are final. We can't then re-look at the decisions. We sometimes get queries asking for more explanation about why the decision was made, but it's very rare that we would overturn a decision. So
Yeah, yeah,
unfortunately,
yeah.
it's hard to challenge those ones.
I think that's really helpful for authors, and they can go out and submit the journal to the manuscript. But I also think it's really important to just the rejection stage is that if you're reviewing a paper, if it's been forwarded, if you're been asked to peer review, then you've made a decision as an editor that it is worthy of peer reviewing, and that it does have potential to be published. Would you agree with that? In terms of their time, yeah, as a
Yeah,
reviewer.
absolutely. And I would say we triage around 80% of the papers we receive at the moment. And some of those we recommend for transfer. We have a mechanism where we can recommend for transfer to JDR CTR. And those types of papers are ones that we think at the editorial desk we feel probably aren't quite suited to the breadth of the JDR, but if they're more focused on clinical and translational research, they might fit with JDR CTR. It's not any guarantee of acceptance, but it is a recommendation over to JDR CTR.
Yeah, that's really, really helpful, so that people recognize that. So to Jocelyne, I'm going to come to the question about disagreement. So again, there's lots of confusion about disagreement from reviewers about disagreement, and how do you deal with situations where we've got disagreement between different reviewers?
Uh, so there is, I think we come across this all the time. So it's really then put into our laps. It's much easier when all the reviewers agree, of course, but then we look at the reviews, we reread the paper, because we read the papers when they first come in. So we reread the paper, we reread the reviewers' comments, and again, I mean, the bottom line really is if it's a major revision versus a rejection, we're going to look to see whether or not the comments are positive enough that if the authors can make these changes, that it is a valuable piece of work, then we may say, okay, let's go for a major revision. And again, the opposite is true. If in fact, one of the reviewers has pointed something out that other reviewers may not have seen that shows that it cannot be improved, then it's going to be a reject. So it really is on our shoulders to make those decisions.
And then we may introduce a third reviewer. I think in JDR,
yes.
you have 3 reviewers for each paper. Yeah.
We would typically try to get 3, yeah, as a minimum.
Yeah. We do the same thing with JDR CTR, but one of the problems is that we can ask for another reviewer. It basically extends the length of time in review, which can be very difficult for an author, particularly if the review ends up saying reject. So if things are clear enough with the 3 reviews we have in, then we may not go to another reviewer. We may have to use our own judgments in those cases.
Yeah, so it goes back to the idea is that ultimately you're the decision makers, really, and you assess the reviews. It's a really interesting question about from editors. Do you selectively send reviewers' comments to the author? Nick?
So we don't selectively send comments. We send all the reviewers' comments. We don't edit the reviewers' comments. There is, however, a mechanism to rescind a review if we feel that the review could be sort of taken the wrong way or highly antagonistic to the authors. You know, reviews need to be fair. They need to be critical, but put yourself in the author's shoes. What would it be like to receive your review report? And if it's worded in a way that would be offensive, for example, then we wouldn't want to send that to the authors. So we do have that mechanism. And then sometimes we might just add an editorial note. We'll make it clear it is an editorial note. But for example, sometimes reviewers ask for specific citations to be added to a paper. Now that can be fine in some circumstances, but there is a concern that reviewers might ask for their own papers to be cited. And so regardless of whether or not the paper comes from the reviewers group, I typically would add a note saying it doesn't, you don't need a very specific paper to be cited, but this may be an indication that you haven't fully captured the literature. So that would be an example of when we might add a little note to a review.
I think that's important. We've got a question about bias, but I think using the editor's note is really important. And I think sometimes having a statement to say that to authors that you may disagree with the comments made by a reviewer, but please address them in your response. I think that's a really helpful note to put in.
To
I think
add,
we, yes, yes.
I just want to add another comment to this. The fact is that when we respond as reviewers, when we're responding to the authors, I think if we can keep it in mind that just try to imagine that the authors are our students, our favorite students, and our mindset when we're trying to help them to write their own papers, that maybe that's the way in which we need to address our reviews and to try to be as helpful as possible, as opposed to trying to find every little minor thing. And it's not a conflict situation, it's a working together to bring out the very best report that we can all possibly bring out. So I just want to raise that
Yeah,
thing.
I think that's really helpful that as a reviewer, you're not the author, it's not your paper, you didn't write it. So yeah, that's really helpful. I think we've looked at this question in terms of negative findings about the challenges of publishing negative findings. I don't know if you want to add anything further about that, Justin, or we can move on to the next set of questions.
No, basically, the main point is that the study needs to be adequately powered and definitely contribute to the literature. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
A question.
I
Yeah,
think
go ahead.
power is just one of those other perhaps common items that people reviewers might want to look at. Is the studies appropriately powered?
Yeah.
That's often
To
an
answer that
indication
research question,
of
that's really
quality.
important. So a question raised about the fairness and unbiased peer reviews and sort of decisions. That I think this is really important. How do you, as editors, ensure that the peer review process is fair, the decisions are neutral and unbiased? I think you've mentioned about, you know, citing your own research as a reviewer, but anything else, Jocelyne?
Yeah. So one thing we do is we try to get three reviewers for every paper. And when I'm choosing reviewers, I try not to choose reviewers from the same institutions. Sometimes I want to go with reviewers who are from a different country if their expertise would apply to what to the environment in which the study was carried out. So we do that. We try to avoid conflicts of interest. Authors do have the right to indicate that there are reviewers they do not want to have review their papers, and on occasion I see that. So that's what we do. A quick story to that is when I was associate editor for the JDR many years ago, an ex-colleague of mine had submitted a paper, and so I did not review it because of a bias. And so I sent it to the editor of the journal at the time. The editor of the journal did not know who this author was, and the country that they lived in, the wife did not take the name of the husband. And so the author put her husband's name on as a potential reviewer. The editor didn't know and asked that individual to review the paper, even though he was from the same institution. And of course, the review was good and the paper was published. I didn't know about this until many years later, but these kinds of things can happen. So we're always trying to be very careful. And if you do receive a paper and you are in conflict in any way, we would really appreciate your letting us know, and we will assign a different reviewer to the
Yeah.
paper.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's really important that in terms of if you're a reviewer and you have a conflict of interest that you cite that and yeah. And also in the comments to the editor, if you feel that you have or you're querying and your conflict of interest, then you can have a note to the editor about that.
I would
Nick,
actually raise it. I would raise any conflict
before
concerns before that,
before
before you
I
do a
agree.
review.
Yeah,
Just
I agree.
contact the editor if you're at all worried and you're not
Yeah,
sure. Just
yeah,
ask the editor.
yeah.
but
Yeah.
don't start a review if you're
Exactly, yeah,
concerned
because
about
that's
content.
it's the confidentiality aspect. Yeah, Nick, maybe you want to talk about this double blind review as the
Yeah,
option. So many I've reviewed for many journals that have a double blind sort of process. What are your thoughts about that?
yeah, and it is certainly an option, and it's not something we necessarily rule out forever. However, there are also disadvantages of this. So this is a mechanism where you have to anonymize the authorship of the paper, so the reviewers don't know who the authors are, and the authors don't know who the reviewer is. Um, and that the idea is that it can reduce bias because you're not then biased knowing in the back of your mind that a certain group has put together the paper. The problem is that actually there is a bias still within those papers because a lot of papers will be recognizable. And science, just the process of science is to build on your previous research and often on your own research. And so papers sort of evolve one to another, and it can be quite clear where a paper has come from.
Yeah,
So all it does is means that some papers are recognizable, some are not, and that then creates a different type of bias. So it's not perfect, but we don't use that mechanism currently, and we just ask people not to consider the authorship of the paper when you're conducting a review.
yeah. I think that's really important. And just to say, as associate editors and editors, that we don't review our papers from our own institution or our own papers. So we always give them to an alternative reviewer. That's really important. Nick, we're going to ask questions about the open data practices. This is really important in terms of credibility of data and publications. I think you're in a really good position to talk about that. You want to tell us about the open data practices?
Yeah, so at the JDR and JDR CTR as well, we've just introduced a new policy to require a data availability statement and to make sure that all data within the papers are openly available upon acceptance of the paper. We're not currently asking for all data to be submitted at the original submission stage. We may move to that in future, but currently our system is to require open data upon acceptance. So at the submission stage, we're asking authors to commit to agreeing that they will make their data open. So we're not asking reviewers to look carefully through the original raw data. However, there may be situations where reviewers do need a bit more information about the data in order to understand the papers. And sometimes in bioinformatics studies, it can be important to see data. So if reviewers feel that they don't have enough in order to evaluate the paper properly, then in their first review, they could recommend a revision and as part of the revision, making the data open at the next stage. So that's possible for reviewers. By open data, we're talking about new data that are generated in the study. Some studies use already open databases or databases that have some kind of gatekeeper, and the authors have got hold of the data. Our open data policy refers to new data created within the
Yeah,
study.
yeah,
We do allow some exceptions, and there are certain study types where there may be exceptions, for example, due to confidentiality. But that's those will be the exception rather
yeah,
than.
yeah. Yeah, I just want to piggyback on that on the exceptions because as a qualitative researcher, that can be challenging in terms of breaching confidentiality. So the exception is that we're not expecting you to publish and share the transcripts because of possible disclosure, but qualitative researchers can share coding trees to show how they've interpreted the data. So I think that's really important in terms of study types. So coming to the last section now, the questions about reviewer recognition. Jocelyne, how are reviewers evaluated by the editors? So what are the criteria that we use to evaluate reviewers?
Okay, so right before I respond to that particular question, I just want to shout out and and tell our reviewers how much we appreciate everything they do. We know that our science cannot get better if the quality of our publications are poor. We've got so much happening right now with AI, generative AI, and journals that are just for commercial use only, and so your work is what is keeping science alive and healthy. So with science would die. It would die. And so because of this, I just wanted to say that before we talk about how we evaluate you, just because we really appreciate all the work that you do in helping move forward. So we are scored on quality of your reviews and on the timeliness of the reviews. We have a 3-point evaluation. Someone chime in and tell me what those categories are, because I forget right now.
There's the timeliness and then the quality of the review. So those are the two things.
Yeah. So 3 is the best, 1 is the worst. And so that's quality of the publication. And then timeliness is the same thing. 3 is very timely, on time. 2 and 1 are less than that. We don't happen to know when we see the score whether the score is related to quality of the review or timeliness. But if we see a lower score, we may be less likely to call on you again. But this is what we do, and it helps to guide us in case reviewers have agreed and yet have not been very helpful in their reviews, or they've agreed and they've never come through with a review. This is very helpful to us in terms of choosing the reviewers on the next paper.
Yeah, and I should stress that that's just an internal system. The scoring system is just internal for the editors to help us select reviewers. But it does mean that if you're consistently getting selected and invited to review, then we do recognize that you're doing a good job. But we appreciate all the work, as Jocelyne says, all the work that reviewers put in.
And I would just add that once you receive the author's decision, you'll see the other reviewers' comments and feedback. And I think that can be really useful in terms of gauging if you've got similar comments or if they've spotted something that you haven't. That's a really good learning opportunity as a reviewer. So we're coming to the final question about reviewer profile and being recognized. Nick, do you want to talk about how can reviewers be recognized?
Yeah, so I think it's really important after people have put in a lot of work to conduct a review that you are recognized for the work that you've put in. And one system that was developed quite a few years ago now was a system originally called Publons, which catalogued all the reviews that people do. It just simply said you've reviewed for this journal, and catalogue those reviews. That's now been integrated into Web of Science, but there is a tick box for us to automatically catalogue your name on and your review on that system. So I would encourage people to do that, because then it gives you a track record of your reviewing activity, and that's something that should be recognized. I think recognition in academia for peer review is sometimes not what it should be. It's such a valuable aspect of being an academic, whether it's reviewing papers or reviewing grants. Peer review underpins the whole of science, and so it should really be recognized. But there are challenges around how you recognize not just the number of reviews that people do, but the quality, because that's also really important. So there are challenges, but I think it's really
Mm.
important that we do recognize these. So we do publish names of reviewers for the journals at the end of the year. And I think one of the biggest benefits of conducting peer review really is learning and developing those skills, which, as I sort of mentioned, are so important for science as a whole and for a career in science. If you're good at critical thinking and you're good at analyzing and understanding where the gaps are and where extra controls might be needed, or where this interpretation wouldn't quite work, those kind of skills are so important throughout. So peer review really is a great way. You really focus in on a paper, you keep up with the latest science, and you learn so much from doing it.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
hopefully that in itself is something, a reason for doing it.
Yeah, I think that's really a great statement. I think just to share a story, I wrote a paper and I got a comment back from one of the editors saying my response to the reviewers' comments was excellent. It was an example, and I think it's because I've done so much peer review, and so I think as a learning opportunity is such a really important skill, and you learn that through peer reviewing. So we're coming to the end of our webinar. Just before we close, I just want to say thank you, but I also just want to give the opportunity for you to share any final last minute comments, any reflections on the webinar before we close, and we say thank you to our reviewers for the questions. So Nick, any closing thoughts? Any tips? I put you on the spot of it.
Well, if you're watching the webinar, then you're obviously interested in doing peer reviews. So thank you for that in the first place. We do work hard to make sure we only send out papers that are high quality, and we're very lucky at our journals that we get high quality submissions. So you will, if you agree to peer review for one of our journals, then you will get a paper that should be of good quality and at least merit the peer review process. You may feel that it's not good enough quality to be published in our journals, but hopefully you'll enjoy the experience. And I just encourage you to really get involved, and we appreciate the work you do.
Yeah, Jocelyne,
Yeah,
any?
so I made some comments earlier, but I just want to say thank you again to our reviewers. There's not a lot more I will add to what Nick has said, but we do appreciate so much the work that you do. The authors always appreciate your comments, even the ones that are highly critical. They will make sure that the authors are able to put out the very best of reports for the journals. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. We hope this conversation has been helpful, and we look forward to seeing you in our next webinar. Thank you.